Hello everyone, it's Scott, and welcome to today's look at Phyrexia All Will Be One spoiler. So we got a lot of cards to talk about. We got a last rare and some interesting commons and uncommons that will have potential to see play in Standard. Definitely will be very limited playable. But before we do that, a couple quick reminders. First, thanks to Caffeinated Gamers for sponsoring our video, and remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this in the future. So let's get started with today's look at Phyrexia All Will Be One. So first we have Dark Slick Shores. This is the last of the land cycle of the set. This one's in blue and black, which certainly helps push the Grixis deck and the Esper deck, because they're going to want this card in their land base, so expect those decks to be helped a little bit by this. In fact, the whole series of lands from Phyrexia All Will Be One, the rare cycle, they're all good cards. They'll all see play somewhere in Standard. Alright, so let's start by looking at some white cards from today. So the first is Mandible Justicaire. For 1 and a white mana, you get an artifact creature that's a Phyrexian Cleric. That's a 2/1 with lifelink. And when another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, Mandible gets +1/+1. So the reason I like this card is there's already kind of sort of a blue-white artifact deck. And this is a card that has lifelink, which is always a good ability, but also then in essence has an affinity for artifacts when they come into play. It gives it +1/+1 until the end of the turn. And in a deck that's truly a dedicated artifact deck, that's going to mean it's going to be a 3/2, sometimes a 4/3. So I think that in of itself makes it a decent card to consider in Standard. Certainly a playable card in Limited. Next we have Flentsling Raptor. For 2 and a white mana, you get a Phyrexian Bird. That's a 2/2. It has flying, it has Toxic 1, and when Flentsling Raptor enters the battlefield, another target creature you control with Toxic gets +1/+1 and gains flying until the end of the turn. One of the colors we know that the Toxic deck is likely to show up in is white, and while this is a common, the fact that it has flying, even though it costs 3 mana, is a pretty good ability. And the fact that another creature, when it enters the battlefield, gets +1 and also gains flying could be a sneak attack that could get a number of extra poison counters on your opponent that they weren't anticipating. And for that reason, I think there's some playability in Standard. Definitely a card that we'll see in Limited. Next, we have Leonin Lightbringer. For 2 and a white mana, you get a Rebel Cat with Ward 2. And as long as Leonin Lightbringer is equipped, it gets +1/+1, and it's a 3/2. So 3/2 cat, again, we have the pieces for potentially an equipped deck, an equipment deck. And if that does happen, this might be a good card in that, because it comes with some natural protection with that Ward 2, and then when it does become equipped, it becomes a 4/3 for 3, and I think that's a pretty decent rate for the card. And we'll just kind of have to see how far that deck's going to get, but this might be an inclusion in that deck. Next, we have a few blue cards to talk about. First is Chrome Prowler. For 2 and a blue mana, you get an artifact creature. That's a Phyrexian Cat. It's a 3/2, and it has flash. And when Chrome Prowler enters the battlefield, tap target creature an opponent controls. The reason I like this card is that it is a flash creature that has an effect when it enters the battlefield. So it's not just flash it in, it can be a blocker. And we've seen a number of cards in Standard with flash, like the Wandering Emperor, that their enter the battlefield ability. In the Wandering Emperor's case, she gets to go ahead and use one of her loyalty abilities. That is a pretty powerful ability. And Chrome Prowler, getting to tap a creature that an opponent controls could be very, very important to the overall outcome of a game. Your opponent might think that, well, I'm going to be able to attack and win the game at this point, but you drop this before their combat, you tap something down, their best creature for attacking, and then you've also put another blocker on the field to potentially protect yourself from lethal, and then that may affect whether they attack or not. So I think that in and of itself is enough to consider it for some play. Certainly we'll see limited play. Escaped Experiment for 1 and a blue mana. You get a 2/1 Phyrexian Artifact Beast, and when Escaped Experiment attacks, target creature an opponent controls gets -X/-0 until end of turn, where X is the number of artifacts you control. So this is again another common, but again the ability to, when it attacks, to give another creature -X/-0. That's a pretty good ability, no matter what the card rarity is, and I think that might push it to playability possibly in a artifact creature deck. Next we have Unctus's Retrofitter. For 2 and a blue mana, you get a Phyrexian Artificer who's a 2/3 with Toxic 1, and when Retrofitter enters the battlefield, up to 1 target artifact you control becomes an artifact creature with base power and toughness 4/4 for as long as Unctus Retrofitter remains on the battlefield. So if we do get that dedicated artifact deck, I think this is a really good include in it, because basically as long as you can keep this card on the field, you play a 1 mana artifact and that would become a 4/4, and it would have haste in essence because it's already on the field, so you'd be able to attack with it right away. So I think that's a pretty good reason to consider this in that artifact deck, because you're probably going to be playing things like Reckoner Bankbuster and other low-cost artifacts already, and this would really help that to improve the overall quality of one of your artifacts. And that could even be an artifact creature like Escaped Experiment, right there. And this is a 4/4 that gives something a -X/-0, then that's a pretty good card. All right, let's move on to black. So we got 2 black cards to talk about today. Infectious Inquiry for 2 and a black mana. You get a sorcery to draw. You draw 2 cards. You lose 2 life. Each opponent gets a poison counter. So we've seen similar cards to this in standard before in black, where you draw 2, lose 2 life. But the poison counter ability is kind of nice as an added bonus to this. So I think there's some playability in standard, again, in a poison deck that wants to draw some cards. Next we have Necrosquito. For 3 and a black mana, you get a Phyrexian Insect. That's a 0/0 and with flying. And Necrosquito enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters on it, and it gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. When another creature or artifact you control is put in the graveyard from the battlefield, it gets an additional poison or oil counter. So again, we've seen a lot of these oil creatures, and this is an interesting one because it has flying, and when other things are put in the graveyard, then it would get an additional one. It is 4 mana, so I think that's a downside of it, but it is an interesting card, certainly limited playable. Next, we have some red cards to talk about. The first is Bard Batterfist. For 1 and a red mana, you get an artifact that's an equipment. It has the 4 Mirrodin ability. You get to create the 2/2 Rebel creature token and attach this to it. And the equipped creature gets +1/-1, so it becomes a 3/1 creature. And its equipped ability for 1. So it's interesting on this one. A 3/1 for 2 manas is an okay ability for this. So I think because of that, again, in that equipment deck, because it's so cheap and the equip cost is so little, there's a possibility that it might see some play. Next, we have Bladegraft Aspirant. For 2 and a red mana, you get a Phyrexian Warrior with Menace and is a 2/3. And equipment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Activated abilities of equipment you control that target Bladegraft Aspirant cost 1 less to activate. So I think this may be one of the best cards of the day, because certainly in limited this is a bomb card, because all those equipments now cost 1 less, so things that were 4 mana now cost 3, so there's more playability for some of the equipment cards in the set, which I think is really important. And if an equipment deck were to form, I think this is the exact kind of card you want in it, because it makes all your other equipment cards cost less. Next, we have Free from Flesh. For a red mana, you get an instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until the end of turn, and put 2 oil counters on it. So I think this might be a card that we could see some play with in the oil counter deck that we're likely to get. Because for 1 mana, you're going to put 2 oil counters on something, and it gets +2/+2 until the end of turn, so it makes it a better attacker, and it increases your oil count. Next, we have Kuldotha Crackler for 2 and a red mana. You get a Phyrexian Hyena. That's a 2/3. It has Trample, and whenever Kuldotha Crackler attacks, it gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is a number of permanents you control with oil counters on them. So again, this is a card that might fit really well into the oil counter deck. Now, it's obviously susceptible to die to things like Cut Down, but because you're going to have other cards that have oil counters on them, this might be kind of more of a top end of that curve where you get attack with it. It has Trample, so that extra damage would go through for every creature you had, or every permanent you had with an oil counter on it. So I think there's some playability there in Standard. Next, we have Contagious Vorak for 2 and a green mana. You get a Phyrexian Boar Beast. That's a 3/3. Again, this is another common with that kind of a nice ability, certainly limited playable. When Contagious Vorax enters the battlefield, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a land from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest of the cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. If you didn't put a card into your hand this way, proliferate. So this is a nice card. So if you need land, you can go get a land card. If you don't, you can just put all 4 on the bottom of your library because it's a May ability, and then you get to proliferate. So increase the number of counters on everything, kind of advance your board state, which I think, for a common is a pretty good ability. Certainly very much a limited playable card. Expect to see this in opponents' decks. Next, we have Thirsting Roots. For a green mana, you get a sorcery that says, choose 1, search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle or proliferate. Any card like this, I think, potentially has playability. Again, if we have a deck where there's a lot of counters on it, whether it's +1/+1 counters or whatever the counters may be, that ability to proliferate and add additional counters is just a great ability. And for 1 mana, that's a pretty good rate for doing that. Next, we have a couple of uncommons that were multicolored from the set from today. So the first we have is Serum Core Chimera. For 2, a blue and a red mana, you get a Phyrexian Chimera. That's a 2/4 with flying, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on Serum Core Chimera. Remove 3 oil counters from Serum Core Chimera, draw a card, then you may discard a non-land card. When you discard a card this way, Serum Core Chimera deals 3 damage to the target creature or planeswalker. Activate only as a sorcery. So we know there's going to be some kind of oil counter deck that's going to happen, because we've got I think 15 to 20 cards right now with this ability of whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you get to put oil counters on things. So this is, again, might be a good kind of more of a top end card in that deck because it has that draw ability, and when you can remove 3 oil counters from it, you can do direct damage to a creature or a planeswalker, and that's a pretty powerful ability that kind of has a sneakiness behind it. People aren't expecting that. So if you cast it on turn 4, on turn 5 you play several things, you remove those 3 oil counters from it, and you do 3 damage to a creature or a planeswalker, and then it has a pretty significant impact on the overall board state. And that in and of itself, I think, makes it something that the oil counter deck is going to want to consider. Last card of the day is Cinder/Ravager. For 4 and a green and a red mana, you get a Phyrexian Warrior. That's a 5/5. And this spell costs 1 less to cast for each permanent you control with oil counters on it. So in theory, you could get a 5/5 for 2 mana. So that's an incredibly cheap rate for this kind of card. But again, it's got to go in an oil counter deck where you're having all your permanents have either they come into play with an oil counter, or they would then be able to get one fairly easily, like Serum Court Chimera does by simply casting a non-creature spell. It also has Vigilance, and when Cinder Slash Ravager enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each creature your opponent controls. That ability in and of itself is a great enter the battlefield ability. It's not quite Goblin Chain Whirler, but it's pretty close. And Goblin Chain Whirler, when it came out in the set Dominaria several years ago, it became a mainstay in Standard. And what it also did was it made 1/1 creatures almost unplayable, because red was incredibly popular at that time, and almost every game you were expecting on turn 3 to have a Chain Whirler come out and do 1 damage to everything on the field. So this doesn't do it to your opponent, it doesn't do it to Planeswalkers, but with all the creatures that are running around in Standard right now, this is a nice ability that you can potentially get as early as maybe turn 3, depending on how many permanents you can get into play quickly with oil counters on them. So I think this does have some playability in that oil counter deck. Alright, that's it for Phyrexia All Will Be One spoilers. I hope you've enjoyed the videos. I've enjoyed bringing them to you. This set looks like it's going to have some significance in Standard in terms of the overall playability of it. Certainly Limited will be a very good format, I think, because of the variety of decks that can be created. So I'll be back later this week with one more Phyrexia All Will Be One spoiler video, where I look at the top 10 cards that I think are going to be the most impactful on Standard. And it's not going to be just about the next season, but over the next couple of years. Thanks for watching, and special thanks again to Caffeinated Gamers for sponsoring these videos, and I will see you in the next one.